Ion by Plato, a brief summary and analysis, and an inquiry into Plato's view of art. This dialogue by Plato is about a conversation between Socrates and a rhapsode named Ion. A rhapsode is a professional reciter and interpreter of poetry. Ion specializes in the poetry of Homer, more specifically the Iliad and the Odyssey. The dialogue begins with Socrates running into Ion after he has just come back from winning first place at the festival of Asclepius. Socrates tells him that he always envied rhapsodes and says that a good rhapsode like Ion must learn Homer's thoughts, not just his verse. He says no one could ever be a good rhapsode unless they can interpret the poet's thoughts well. The focus of this dialogue is a debate on the source of Ion's talent. Ion argues his talent is based on knowledge. Socrates argues that it is because Ion is divinely inspired. Socrates uses the example of a doctor to prove his point. He asks Ion if a number of people are speaking about nutrition, will the same individual be able to evaluate whether each person is speaking well and speaking poorly on the subjects? Ion says it would be the same individual. Socrates says that same individual would be called a doctor, because a doctor has knowledge of nutrition. Socrates points out that Homer and the other poets like Hesiod and Archilochus all speak on the same subjects. However, Ion can only speak about Homer's poetry and not the other poets. If Ion is speaking through knowledge, then he would be able to speak about the writings of not just Homer, but all the other poets, just like the doctor who can make comments on all the people who speak about nutrition. Socrates tells Ion that speaking well about Homer is not a subject he has mastered. He says it's a divine power. He uses the analogy of a magnetic stone that moves and puts power into iron rings, which allows these rings to do the same. He uses a three-ring analogy. He says the first ring is the poet, the second ring is the rhapsode, and the third ring is the audience. I think the best example of this three-ring analogy that Socrates makes is using the example of classical music. You could say that the first ring is the composer of the music, the second ring is the conductor and orchestra that performs the composition, and the third ring is the audience. And I think this description illustrates the importance of the second ring. For example, if you take a composition by a great composer like Beethoven, you could see if you don't have a competent conductor and orchestra that can not just perform the music note for note, but interpret it the right way, the music will not have a good effect on the audience. So you could say if you don't have a rhapsode who can interpret Homer's poetry as well as Ion, the audience may not benefit as much from Homer's poetry. Ion then tells Socrates that he thinks Socrates is speaking well. However, he hasn't convinced him that he is crazed or possessed when speaking about Homer. Socrates then asks Ion to recite a passage from the Iliad in which Homer describes a chariot race. Ion recites the passage, and Socrates asks him whether a doctor or charioteer would know if Homer is speaking well in the passage. Ion responds it's a charioteer. What's interesting to note is this is the only time in the dialogue that Ion recites anything from Homer, and Ion never interprets anything from Homer's poetry. If you'll recall at the start of this dialogue, Socrates says that no one would ever be a good rhapsode unless they could interpret the poet well. So if interpreting Homer well is central to being a good rhapsode, then the reader doesn't have the privilege of listening to a person who is divinely possessed, since Ion never interprets Homer. It's possible the reason why Plato does not show this is that it isn't possible to describe a person divinely possessed in the written language. Socrates then points to other passages by Homer that speak about medicine, fishing, and divination, and has Ion agree that a rhapsode would not be able to explain if Homer is speaking well in them. However, Ion will not concede that he is not speaking through knowledge and says these are just exceptions, and that he is in fact speaking about Homer through knowledge. Socrates then gives more examples of which Ion admits a rhapsode would not know about. Finally, Socrates gives Ion the example of a general. Ion says, that is a profession that a rhapsode like he would have knowledge of. Ion is probably certain of this since the Iliad has many passages that deal with military strategy. However, Socrates gets him to admit if he had the knowledge of a general, then Athens would surely hire him as a general. Socrates then tells Ion if he continues to hold on to this belief that he has knowledge, he's doing wrong. Ion then finally concedes to Socrates' argument that he is in fact divinely possessed when speaking about Homer. One thing Plato's dialogues are known for is that they instigate questions within the reader. One of the most obvious questions concerning this dialogue would be, what is Plato's opinion on poetry or art in general? In some of his previous dialogues, Plato portrays a negative opinion on this subject. In the Apology, a poet named Miletus plays a role in prosecuting and condemning Socrates to death. In the Republic, Plato has Socrates ban art or most art from his ideal city, saying it's 2 steps removed from reality. In Ion, the overall tone of the dialogue is friendly. While Ion and Socrates disagree in areas, there doesn't appear to be any hostility felt towards each other. In areas, they show admiration. In the opening, Socrates tells Ion he has envied rhapsodes like him, and in another area of the dialogue, Socrates asks Ion if he wants him to clarify something he said, and Ion responds by saying, "Yes, I do, Socrates. I love to hear you wise men talk." Socrates then responds, "I wish that were true, Ion, but wise? Surely you are the wise men, you rhapsodes and actors, you and the poets whose works you sing. As for me, I say nothing but the truth." Plato's views on art may be explained by a theory he uses in his dialogues. In several of his dialogues, he uses a theory of opposites. He has Socrates imply that if a person knows something, they will also know the opposite of what they know. In this dialogue, he gets Ion to agree that if a number of people are speaking about arithmetic, it will be the same person who can pick out who is speaking good and who is speaking bad. In other words, if a person knows what a good speaker of arithmetic is, then they will know what a bad speaker of arithmetic is, because the opposite of a good arithmetic speaker is a bad arithmetic speaker. If you apply this theory to Plato's dialogues, you may be able to conclude that he is saying consciously or unconsciously that art and philosophy are opposites. Many scholars believe that Plato's dialogues are as great of works of art and literature as they are of philosophy. If you apply his theory of opposites, you could say that if Plato has knowledge of philosophy, then he would have a good knowledge of its opposite, which would be art and literature. This could explain why his dialogues are considered both great works of philosophy as well as art and literature, as they show he has an understanding of both.